Good morning and welcome to the WIOA Wednesday Webinars. My name is Scott Shook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar. As a reminder, all participants on the call are in mute mode. Please use the chat box for any comments and questions that you might have. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Illinois WorkNet website within the next 24 hours. Usually by the end of today. You will receive a survey asking you about today's webinar. Please share with us your experience and any suggestions that you might have that might help us to improve these webinar sessions. With that, I have a couple of questions that we would like to, our poll questions that we would like to ask you to complete. The first question should be present on your screen at this time. Okay, and if the questions that you have or the answers don't fit your situation, I have actually a second set. So I'm gonna ask you to vote on the second set if that fits your category as well. I can share that information. And I'm going to move to the second set. The same question, just a different set of answers. I'm going to close that and share that information. And with that, I'm actually going to turn this session over to Mark Burgess, who will be leading our discussion on one-stop certification, the one-stop certification process.
Thanks, Scott. When you put the second slide up, it was actually a repeat of the first. If you please put that second one up for those that are representing other, especially our partner programs. Welcome and thanks, Scott. This is Mark Burgess with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Also work as staff to the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board. I hope you've all been enjoying the series of webinars we've been producing. This is the fifth in that series as a follow-up to the 2019 WIOA Summit that was held in April. If you recall, we polled everyone as to what they wanted to see, and we are, have been gradually going through all of those topics, including the service integration assessment, collaborative efforts, and this one is your last of those 5. We'll be continuing the webinar series going forward, not necessarily every week, but hopefully get you a couple of those each month moving forward as we continue the technical assistance and outreach that you've asked for as part of the summit and in other various efforts to get your input to the technical assistance needs you have. Today we're talking about the one-stop certification process. This was a very well-received session at the summit. We've incorporated some of the responses, some of the input during that session into this presentation. So if you joined at the summit, you will hear a little bit different presentation than that day. Today I've got some representatives from local workforce innovation area 6, DuPage County. We've got David Sabathny, who is the one-stop operator, and we've also got Jamie Brown, who is the staff to the local workforce board there in DuPage County. They'll be interjecting some thoughts as we go through this presentation. We utilize them and ask them to join us because they did a very thorough development of a policy and process for certification that occurred back in 2017. And so we wanted to get some input from them that they could share as best practices for all of you. Today we'll be talking about the process that occurred in 2017, so we'll give a little bit of a history. We'll talk about the one-stop operator role, especially as it relates to the certification process. We'll be detailing some of the steps in that process, and then take some time to go over what we learned during the 2017 certification process from the local boards that were submitted. We've got some best practices as well as some concerns and challenges they had, areas for improvement opportunities. And then finally, we'll talk about what we're going to do going forward as a state and for the local boards and one-stop operators in certification to occur in the 2020 program year. So with that, we'll get started with the first slide. As you all recall, 2017 was the first time that the certification was required by local boards. All of the comprehensive centers at that time were required to have certification occur. And excuse me, Scott, can you start the slide presentation? I'm not getting that.
Okay.
There we go. Thanks. Policy was put into effect, approved by the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board at their board meeting in March of 2017. Some significant dates came with that to ensure that all the certifications occurred by July 1st of 2017. We asked that applications the process begun and submitted by the one-stop operator in May of 2017. Local certification teams, and we'll talk about those teams a little bit later, made recommendations to their local board sometime in June, with the final approval of the local boards, an indication of such to the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board prior to July 1st of 2017. The next significant date there is that July 1st of 2018, another policy came into effect. The one-stop delivery system became effective, and we'll talk about the significance of that a little bit later. I really appreciate Dave Sabathny joining us today as a one-stop operator. With some input from him, we developed some of the roles that they take on, some of the roles that we know WIOA expects of one-stop operators. So we'll go through a few of those now. The most significant is that really the one-stop operator's role is to coordinate service delivery at all of our American Job Centers or WorkNet centers. And those duties may include some of the following. If you could proceed on the next slide, Scott. You'll see here a nice list: managing the daily operations and partner responsibilities outlined in MOUs, coordination and tracking partner referrals, reviewing center accessibility. We all know that all of our centers have to be accessible, both programmatically and physically. And so we want to make sure that all those accessibility surveys and reports are being done in a timely fashion. Any identified issues are corrected as well in a timely fashion. They are the kind of the conduit between the system and the local boards, so they're reporting to local boards on operations, performance, and identifying continuous improvement opportunities, listening to those local boards and taking back their thoughts, their requirements, especially through policies and procedures, to all of our partners at the local level. Then finally, they're ensuring that all of our centers, all of our partners are adhering to the federal and state regulations, guidance, and any other policy issued beyond just the WIOA Act. They may establish additional roles. I think WIA 6 have a few more outlined that we didn't put onto this slide, but many of you that work with your one-stop operator may know of others. We would certainly like to hear from you if you've got some ideas as to what you think are some critical roles of the one-stop operator. You can always feel free to contact me, and we can take those into consideration as policy is developed in the future. I do want to make a note down at the bottom that, and then ask that Dave and Jamie kind of speak to their position on the one-stop operator selection and roles. But per policy in WIOA, the one-stop operator assumes a lot of roles. In many of our local areas, the one-stop operator might also be the Title I administrator and they might also be assuming the role of the staff to the local board. We just want to make sure everyone keeps in mind that as those roles are conducted, that they are considering the firewalls and other conflict of interest policies and procedures, and ensuring those are being adhered to as they develop those. So, Dave and Jamie, if you wouldn't mind speaking to the decisions that were made at local board in DuPage County, I'd appreciate it.
This is Jamie. Good morning, everybody. I can speak to our selection process. We did, as everybody else did, we did RFP, and we were fortunate that we did get some external responses. Dave and his chamber were one of those responses. I think for our area, it has been very nice to have a neutral third party, that being Dave, as our one-stop operator. I know that a lot of areas may not have had a lot of responses to the RFP. So, but I think it has been really beneficial to us to have a neutral third party, because if there are issues between partners or things that need to be sorted out, Dave can step in. And I think that does eliminate any, conflict of interest, because obviously, as Title I, we're responsible for working very closely with our partner agencies. I think Dave can speak to, when he did start, there was obviously a ramp-up period. He did not know a lot about WIOA and all things that go with it. So he had a lot to learn, and he definitely learned all of that. But I think that it's been great for us to have him on board and as that sort of neutral third party. Dave, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure. So my introduction to the American Job Center, WorkNet DuPage, was really in that we, as a Chamber of Commerce, were involved in workforce development and doing ETIP grants as an administrator directly through the Department of Commerce, out of need, not necessary desire to delve into that. And then we began doing some in-depth training in workforce development. So when this opportunity presented itself and I looked at the criteria, it made a lot of sense for us to be involved, both from our business member representation, because they were all just dying for employees, and so it would give us a thumb on the pulse of what was happening in the workforce, but also provide that independent view to the other partners. And so, yes, Jamie is correct. When I went in there and I would listen to these amazing professionals throw 5 acronyms into a single sentence, and I would just be shaking my head, having no idea what they said, but seeing in their eyes clearly that they were very serious and it was important for me to know. So after I learned the 400 acronyms or so, I became a lot more comfortable. But the role does expand itself, just like the documents that guide us. Each center does grow organically, and it's designed intentionally for that purpose. So I've done such things as, fixing a printer, writing up a space allocation policy and request forms so that partners, when they were expanding or contracting and needed additional space and resource, there was a mechanism to be able to do that. Certainly in conflict resolution, when a situation comes up, it's very difficult sometimes for people who are working so closely together to not take things very personal, and sometimes things could get out of control. And so I've been brought in by a number of the partners to say, look, we've had this challenge, and I think we've been able to resolve it very well, and certainly make sure that all the partners know that this access point is available to them, and that we will deal with it professionally and help support them in a way that I think has helped our center. And of course, when we do have something to implement, there are certainly agencies that are the bigger dog in the park, and they too could use that additional breadth and depth of their staff and their involvement, and kind of everyone else has to go along with them, where I think I give a different perspective, and we really are setting it from the 50,000 foot level, seeing how we are able to provide the service best, a customer-centered focus, dealing with our businesses, dealing with whether it's Perkins or WIOA or CSEP, whatever, to be able to make sure that they all get their time and their priorities, and that we're all working together. I think it's worked really well, but I will tell you that it's only one center, and they are just an extraordinary group of people. What came out of the summit was, in general, one-stop centers do have really strong working relationships with one another, so that's not so uncommon. But certainly it was a benefit for me to walk into a center that, one, had already submitted before I got there for certification and did, again, an extraordinary job of that, and a group of people that really looks to work together. So that's all the input I have right now.
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
So I did have a question that came in from Pam. So do I understand that the local Chamber of Commerce is the OSO?
That is correct. Yes, we are the Western DuPage Chamber of Commerce, and as such, we qualify to be able to be a one-stop operator. Well, that happens to be one of them. Yes, we are a regional Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dave, and good question there. I think we'll be revisiting that. I think everyone knows, and we aren't going to touch on all the policies today, but there's policies on one-stop operator procurement that will need to be addressed at the local level. So if there are questions with that, please hold your questions till the appropriate time when we do a webinar on that topic, or we pull people together for policy development. And if you've got any specific questions you'd like that maybe you want to send through Dave, I don't want to throw him out there and end up getting 100 questions. Feel free to contact me. We'll be providing information for contacts at the end of the presentation. You can certainly contact me if you have any questions, and I'll reach out to Dave on behalf of a group of respondents, as opposed to him getting dozens or more emails requesting information. So we're going to move on to the next slide, where we're going to start talking about the process itself. As you recall, back in 2017, that policy dictated through an application for certification that needed to be completed by LWIB. So the steps to the certification are that we would expect that the local boards develop a written one-stop certification procedure. While that wasn't a requirement of the policy, it was encouraged, and we think, as you'll see when you go through this process, as well as some of the takeaways from the 2017 certification, I think you'll see good reasons why you want to have something that is on paper, that is consistently enforced through the local board's policy. So we'll speak a little bit more to that. So the start of the process is just submitting to the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board, the LWIB, your notice of intent to apply for certification for each center. In 2017, that included only comprehensive centers. As we move forward in the next round of certifications, we'll note that that includes all designated centers, and I'll define designated centers. As there is a policy, I mentioned it on the first slide, the one-stop delivery system policy that went into effect July 1st, 2018. WIOA policy 1-12 on one-stop delivery system requires that every local board designate centers, whether those be comprehensive centers, affiliate centers, or specialized centers. If they formally designate centers, then those centers will now, moving forward, need to have a certification done of them on at least an every 3-year basis. Additionally to that policy, I think especially those of you that are local board staff or maybe joining us from a local board need to be mindful that that designation decision needed to be made as of July 1st of this year, 2019. And the simple process to do that, we're all aware of. We identify on Illinois WorkNet all of our service provider locations. And within that process on Illinois WorkNet, you can identify whether the center is designated or not. So we may be considering holding a webinar or at least providing some communication to the local boards, staff, and one-stop operators regarding that policy to remind them if they've not done that designation, it's critical that they really get that done in the next several weeks to a few months, because it will also relate to MOUs, one-stop infrastructure funding, and again, the certification process as we near July 1st, 2020. The process then moves on to conducting the certification, and it's a two-part process. Certain things such as policies that are reflected in the application, maybe the accessibility surveys that are done on an annual basis, things that are done on a routine basis that are already conducted prior to certification being done can be done through desk reviews. Also, our organizational charts, functional charts can be reviewed, desk review. That saves some of the time on site that's required once the certification team starts evaluating and assessing each of the centers that are designated. On-site observation is the next process. So once they've got some information in hand, the expectation they would visit all the centers that are going to be certified, speak to staff, speak to administrators about the operations as they review that application and complete it. Once they've done that, they will then make a recommendation as a team to the local boards. There are three types of certifications that, really only two types of certifications. You either get certified fully or you have a provisional certification where there are certain items that the certification team or the local board feel need to be completed before they want to sign off on full certification of a particular center. And then if they feel like there's just too many deficiencies at a given time during this process, they may not certify it at all. And we'll speak a little bit to that on the next slide here. Once those certification recommendations are received by the local board, they then confirm and accept the recommendation, or they may deny it. They may look at what the certification team recommended and might see some deficiencies that they think more significant than the certification team did. I don't know that I would expect that would happen very often. I think the LWIBs in identifying a certification team are expecting that their evaluations, their recommendations would be consistent with the board as a whole. But certainly there could be instances where the board looks at that recommendation, looks at the overall certification process and results, and determines maybe a different level of certification than what was recommended by that team. If there is a denial, or maybe after certification something changes at a particular center that the local board then revisits the certification process and revokes a previously determined recommendation for certification, which can occur, then there's a couple things that should happen. They should request a new certification be conducted. That might be more appropriate for a denial of the original certification process more so than revocation. And then they may also approve a different level of certification. So maybe in evaluating the situation for a particular center, the certification team indicates full certification as a recommendation, but the board feels a couple of deficiencies need to be addressed before they will sign off on full certification. They may downgrade it to provisional and expect certain things occur before they give that full certification. And as always, in most of our policies issued at the state level, and even within certain programs, there's an appeals process. So maybe the center administrator doesn't agree with the certification team's assessment and recommendation. They can certainly go before the board, express their case, and maybe get a different decision made. In instances where there is no certification provided, whether that be upon the certification recommendation or as the 3-year period of certification occurs or continues, something changes significantly or dramatically enough that the local board wants to revoke certification, the board should have some kind of a contingency plan for continuation of services. We don't want to just have them closing down doors unless it's so egregious that really the services being provided are not providing any value to the customers. Again, back to the policy and procedures the local board should have in place, I would expect that would be a good place to have some of the instances, and the process for a contingency plan would be within those procedures. Moving on to follow-up actions, if there are some issues with the certification identified as deficient that need to be corrected, there should be a plan in place on how to complete those, a timeline for completing those. If you'll recall, the initial policy and the initial certification, and actually still continuing to this day, as outlined within the policy and procedures and the process for certification, did not really provide any structure to the state, the state board, IWIB, responding to any deficiencies. It's really up to the local board to look at those deficiencies and agree with the timeline and ensure that those issues are completed within a reasonable amount of time. Going forward, potentially changes in the future might include where there's a formal process for ensuring corrections are occurring. Within that, maybe part of that plan is that there's an annual report on continuous improvement. So especially as it relates to service integration, we're all being more familiar with that in the process for completing a self-assessment and implementing particular processes, policies, procedures to improve along the continuum of service integration. They might ask for an annual report to indicate from each of the centers what they're doing to continuously improve upon what exists today. All of these should be followed up with information to the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board of the status, both of the certification recommendation and then any follow-up necessary. If there's especially a denial or revocation, let us know. Again, I just mentioned that the board right now, state board, is not following up to ensure deficiencies are being corrected, but in the future, I believe the board and the Evaluation and Accountability Committee may take that up as an issue to ensure that significant issues are being addressed. I do want to make one point that when I mention any kind of follow-up from the state board or the policy in general, this isn't about a got you situation where we're looking for areas where we can, identify those deficiencies from a state level. It's really about identifying best practices, and we'll talk about some of those here in a moment. It's really identifying where needs exist for improvement and sharing those with all of the local areas. So after the 2017 submissions, we looked at those. We identified quite a list of notable practices, best practices, but we also identified some areas that the certification teams thought there was some improvement needed, and we'll mention a few of those, especially some of those that were consistent across multiple local boards certifications. But from a state board perspective, it's really not about a monitoring or a finding. It's about sharing of information, and I think one of the probably downfalls of that first process was that we didn't gather enough information. So in the next round in 2020, the new certification process really stresses getting information, gathering information from the certification teams so that we can all learn from each other. Moving on to the next one, Scott. Each of the local boards will identify certification teams, but beyond the certification team, there are many partners, many players, stakeholders that were involved in the certification process. The certification team obviously was the one conducting the evaluations and making the recommendation to the local boards. But I'm sure many of you on the call today, and Scott, maybe you can throw up the poll that we put together here to let us know your level of involvement during the certification process as we go through this. One-stop operators had a role in this to assist in identifying some of those areas of criterion and the basis for determination, as well as determining any plans of correction that would be necessary for each of those comprehensive centers that were certified in 2017. Core and required partners, especially leadership, might have been involved in the certification process. The local teams may have been coming to you for specific requests and responses to their questions. Frontline staff might have been providing some various input to those responses, as they're the ones on a day-to-day basis that are implementing the procedures and policies of the local boards and of each of our partners. And there might have been other stakeholders, businesses or community-based organizations or training or service providers that might have been involved. So, a lot of people were involved with this. And then once the certification recommendation occurred, certainly the LWIB members and LWIB staff were quite involved in ensuring that the certification was comprehensive, complete, and those plans for correction were put into place. So what we learned from 2017, I think as I mentioned, we received a lot of input, although the intent of the next round of certification is to get even more input, again, for best practice gathering and sharing amongst the state. So some of the four large areas of notable practices and strengths where we heard from multiple LWIB certification teams were around one-stop center improvements and serving customers. They felt like they put some good processes in place. If you'll go to the next slide, Scott, please. They feel like some of the locations felt like they had strong working relationships among partners and with their community. They also feel like they've done a good job of training staff. And then finally, tracking the referral of practices they felt were in place. What's kind of ironic about that is when we moved to the opportunities for improvement, there were centers and certification responses that indicated the opposite of that. So certainly it indicates that we've got some people doing some good things out there, some local areas, local boards, and one-stop centers doing great things that we can all learn for and improve on in other areas of the state. I just want to go through a few of the highlights of those notable practices around the four areas I talked to. Certainly ensuring that staff understand better all of the programs, all of the services are available through all of our partners. So developing a comprehensive service matrix was one thing somebody highlighted. Providing kiosks and calendars of workshops to better inform our customers and participants of what's going on in the local area, what services are available, how they can better access those services. In fact, using TV areas within our one-stop, the receiving areas, was another example of how they felt like they were improving services to customers, providing user-friendly websites. And then several partners talked about the ability to work side by side with partners. So collaborative and communication were some of their strong points they felt. Several partners working together, over the last 5 years to improve that. I think we'll certainly see that as we start delving into service integration and receiving the self-assessments. We'll be able to see which areas feel like they're doing a better job moving from isolation to integration. And then overall, just again, the need to address providing improved information and training opportunities to staff were highlights of some of those as far as they felt like they've been doing a good job, although they might have identified that they could probably do a better job as well. With the opportunities for improvement, they really fell within three different areas: effectiveness in serving customers, accessibility infrastructure, which relates to those accessibility surveys that are conducted on an annual basis, and then just providing a continuous improvement opportunity to everyone. Expanding upon that, some of the items that we saw as maybe some ideas to improve those services and addressing the needs of our customers, including both the job seeker, worker, and the business client, is initiating some all-staff meetings and training. So again, you see staff development process, flyers to inform staff of the various programs and services available. You'll see that we can learn from who has done a good job and take that to those who are indicating within their process that they really need some assistance. Under accessibility infrastructure, there were some ideas related to specific elements of the accessibility surveys, identifying appropriate exits and accessibility or accessible areas of the facilities, improve safety throughout those facilities, identifying necessary and designating parking spaces for customers to ensure accessibility is being addressed. And then under the continuous improvement, some of the highlights that people felt they needed some help with were a formal process for partner onboarding, in-service and cross-training. Some of these kind of overlap between the effectiveness, because certainly as the staff become more familiar with partners, become more familiar with the services available, it relates to the effectiveness in serving customers. And again, staff training just seemed to be one of the highlights under continuous improvement. And I think we'll see that as we move forward with the self-assessment process for service integration. Some of the ideas that we came up with to ask of you, or you just ask of yourselves, we saw some centers, and if you'll move to the next slide, Scott, we saw some centers change their hours because as they took in some customer feedback, when those hours were helpful to them, and maybe when they were maybe not providing the maximum open doors to them to receive services. So, you know, we asked local boards and one-stop operators and then the centers themselves to look at their hours. Are you serving your customer best with the hours, the days you're open, and the hours you have available for them to access the services? Were there any increased professional development for staff after the initial round of certifications because you identified that as maybe an area for improvement? Did you change the flow within your one-stop centers, such as make the frontline and front desk staff and counselors, you know, operate in a different fashion to ensure a better coordinated customer centered service? And then finally, has anyone considered, as they start moving towards the next round of one-stop operator procurement, changing the process for that? We heard from Dave and Jamie, especially why they went through the process the way they did and identified using an independent outside one-stop operator rather than using one of the partners or a consortium of partners. So, you know, did your local board and the certification team identify that as maybe something to consider in this next round? And if so, are your procedures starting to reflect that? So when you go to put out your RFPs for the next one-stop operator, are you going to include that within that RFP? Some of the other things we learned from that are really around service integration, that the current application didn't reflect service integration as full as it would have. We hadn't embarked on the full service integration policy development, and certainly hadn't had the approval by the board and started the technical assistance that have been occurring in the last 6 to 8 months. So we've learned a lot that needs to be included within the new application. And one clarification I'd like to make on that and differentiate service integration from one-stop center certification, if you'll move to the next slide, Scott, is that service integration really applies to the entire system, local system. So when service integration self-assessments are occurring, and I think those teams that have been involved in a pilot project will be able to attest to, the discussions are about how is our entire local system working together to integrate. Whereas the one-stop center certification is really specific to a local center specific. So you're doing certifications for each of those centers. It's not as a group of centers combined. So I think it's important to realize that, because the discussion will be a little bit different when you try to go through each of those processes, both the self-assessment for service integration and the certification. Those self-assessments will be coming in here in the next couple months, and the certification will be due next year by July 1st. reminding everyone that only designated comprehensive affiliate and specialized centers are required to be certified. Those are designated as outlined by the local board, not by the state. So certainly, you could have multiple locations, maybe 10 locations as an example, within your local area where services are provided, but the local board chooses only to designate one comprehensive center and maybe two affiliate centers. It's left up to the local board through consultation with system partners, the stakeholders within the local area, to identify which centers should be designated. Without getting too much into that policy, there's reasons for being designated because it includes, the responsibility to a MOU and cost infrastructure funding sharing agreements. So, the local board should have taken those considerations into account when they designated. If, again, the local board hasn't made those designations formally, they should be doing that as soon as possible so that the next set of processes that are in response to the designation can start occurring. There is no prohibition to other centers being certified. So if you have in that 10-center local area, the local board only identified 3 of them as designated. The other 7 could go through the certification process, whether that's voluntary or the local board chooses to include them in the process. Again, I would encourage that be part of the procedures developed by the local board so that all centers realize that if they're going to be providing services, they will be expected to be part of a certification process. And maybe those procedures identify some of the centers that are exempt from certification, such as some of our satellite sites, a library or a smaller facility maybe providing only minimal amount of services to our customers. When you go through the certification process, nothing within the policy requires every single criterion be considered attained in order to get full certification. There might be some instances where a local board has indicated that if there are a few minor deficiencies, they are comfortable with giving full certification. I think within those procedures and potentially in future versions of the policy, there might be some criterion that will be mandatory, such as an MOU. If that MOU is not completed and signed by all partners, a local board may choose not to give them full certification, give them only conditional certification until that MOU is finalized. Again, it's really up to them to determine what fits within a mandatory criterion and what does not. Potentially future policy may dictate some of those, and we'll learn that based on the input of all of the certification processes when we review those after the 2020 submissions. And as I mentioned, there's nothing right now that is considered mandated, although I think some local boards will consider some of those mandatory in order to get full certification. Another reason to have a policy locally is there are a lot of words that appear in WIOA that appear within policy and especially appear within some of the criterion or the bases for determination that are kind of ambiguous. It might say we'll provide frequent training to staff. We'll provide training as appropriate, and we'll provide it in a timely fashion. Well, it's pretty hard for any of us to know what that means unless it's defined locally. At the state level, again, we stayed out of the game of defining those kind of terms because we felt it was important to let the local boards and at the local level make some determinations on that. But I think that the main goal of words of that is for the local boards in the certification process to identify what is most appropriate, meaning if someone starts, best example, someone starts as a new employee within a one-stop center and they go through an orientation process, and then policies state that you'll be provided additional training as appropriate. What might be appropriate is that your responsibilities change, so now you should require some new training to ensure you are provided the resources and information necessary to do those new duties in an effective and efficient manner in serving our customers. So I would ask that if your local boards are putting in policies, they look at some words like that and kind of define those as to how they want them assessed within the certification process. All right, so what's next? Let's go ahead and stop there. I probably should have stopped once before. Let's go ahead and stop there before we go to next steps. Does anyone have any questions about the current process and what occurred in 2017 as you now get ready to embark on the next round of certifications? We'll go ahead and open up the lines. Or Scott, if you've identified any through the chat pod that are relevant to answer at this point.
We do have a few questions that have come through. Number one, who oversees the Title I functions in that area?
As an overall question, it's not really specific to certification, but certainly a very important question. Local boards really have oversight of the entire local system. They, along with the one-stop operator, should be looking at all of those partners and ensuring that they're complying with all the elements of the MOU, Memorandum of or Methods of. I always forget what MOU stands for. Memorandum of Understanding. I'm sorry, can't get that one out today. So it's really up to the one-stop operator to coordinate discussions for development of the MOU and upon the local boards to ensure that the process is handled in an effective manner. And ultimately, they are responsible for the local system, so they have oversight of all of the partners, not just the Title I partners.
Okay, another question. It's asking, do you mean that a designate? You mean designated as a comprehensive, correct? Somewhere that's somewhat. Maybe I can get more definition on that. Another one, is the entire local system include all counties in your LWIA?
Yes, the local system is within your boundaries of the local workforce innovation area, and specific to certification, all centers within those boundaries are considered one-stop centers, American Job Centers. Again, there might be some satellite locations such as a library that may choose not to post the American Job Center logo or Illinois WorkNet Center because they receive no funds, but they're willing to help somebody coming in looking to maybe do a job search on their computers. It's really up to the local board to identify which of those centers from a comprehensive, which must be designated because it's got all of the, programs associated with it, down to those affiliates and specialized centers. It's really up to the local board to identify which ones they want to formally designate and bring with it all the associated compliance issues such as MOUs, certification, one-stop structure, infrastructure funding, and there might be some others that I'm not mentioning within that list. It doesn't mean if they're not designated they can't provide services. I think one of the benefits, and maybe Dave or Jamie can even respond to this, one of the benefits to designated a center is that there's some consistency. There's some expectations of those centers because they do have to go through these more stringent processes that maybe a center that's not designated as an affiliate specialized wouldn't otherwise have to go through.
Yeah, Mark, I would address that by saying because the goal is to create this seamless delivery and there's, any door will work, right? So with an affiliate, that is particularly the expectation that that person is going to get plugged into the system properly, go through the same inputting process is probably pretty remote. So from our standpoint, the affiliates could certainly be of value, but I would see a real value in having them a part of our program and part of the MOU and in our facility to be able to make sure that, in fact, that customer-centered design, which we've invested so much time in ensuring is effective, actually gets to every person who's inquiring.
Great, thanks, Dave. While we're receiving some more questions, Scott, could you pull up the poll? Just kind of curious to see the size of each of the local areas as far as those that have already had local boards designate their facilities, how many centers within their local area have been designated. So if you can put up that poll, that'd be great. And then Are there any other questions that need addressed at this time before we move to the last couple slides?
No additional questions have come in.
Okay. While you're putting up that poll, we'll move on to the next slide. It's really about the next steps in the certification process. There's 3 key dates to consider, and one's really not a date as much as it's a period of time where we anticipate providing some technical assistance. So as of June 30th this year, we mentioned this, all of these centers should have been designated by the local boards as either comprehensive or affiliate or specialized. And specialized is just a type of affiliate center where it's maybe focusing on a particular population, focusing on a particular barrier, or maybe focusing on a particular layoff event. So we know some local areas have opened up new centers because they had a large layoff and they wanted to address those many customers that are going to need services in a very short amount of time. With those, a local board could or choose not to include those as a designated center. Throughout the rest of 2019 and into 2020, we're going to be continuing to provide technical assistance such as webinars like we're doing today. As we roll out the new certification application and the guide to that, we will want to provide some kind of technical assistance, whether that be in a webinar or maybe in an in-person workshop to get your thoughts on how best you're going to implement that at the local level. We'll have a poll at the end of the session asking you how you prefer some of these types of technical assistance to occur. So while there's no dates attached to that, specifically, we will be developing a plan to provide technical assistance. It might extend into the WIOA Summit. Certainly, I think we can learn from the service integration self-assessments, some new elements that relate to certification that we'll be incorporating into these technical assistance events. And then finally, as of June 30th, 2020, the next round of certifications will need to be done. And related to that are that regional local plans will be updated in 2020, so they should reflect those designations. Negotiating some MOUs should reflect the changes and ensure that all those that are designated are included in the MOU. And then all those designated centers, as mentioned, will have a certification conducted utilizing the current applications. That's key. A decision was made by the policy development team that since we're adding affiliate and specialized sites to the certification process, whereas in 2017, the only expectation was that comprehensive centers were certified. Since we're adding new sites, they preferred keeping the old process, the old application, if a local board so chose to use that one. But there is a new application that incorporates service integration, incorporates some steps that we learned from 2017, and kind of clarifies and clears up some of the unclarity that might have occurred within some of the criterion or bases for determination. So it's really up to the local board to determine if the certification is conducted by July 30th, 2020, whether they're going to use the old application and process or going to go ahead and use the new process. As mentioned, July 1st of 2020 would be critical in that if a certification comes in, is submitted beyond that date, beyond June 30th of 2020, the new application will have to be utilized. So we'll have to make sure everyone keeps that in mind as you're completing the certification at the local level and thinking you're going to use the old process, the old application. We need to receive those before July 1st, 2020, or they won't be accepted. I think, and again, if Dave or Jamie want to chime in here, I think we'll see some local boards want to use the new process because it's so consistent with the new self-assessment and service integration elements. Having incorporated those, it's a cleaner process, and really the key to the new criterion and the new process is that there's more space for us to learn from you. So there's under every set of criterion, there's an area where you can, the certification team, I'm sorry, not necessarily you, but the certification team can enter comments and notes related to either the criterion or the basis for determination, especially when the list, if all are familiar with the actual application, there are anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 bases for determination. Those aren't the only bases that can be utilized in consideration of indicating achieved a particular criterion or attain that criterion. So if there's something else that a certification team feels can be utilized to meet a particular criterion, we want to hear from those. So the process allows for a lot more information gathering, so that we at the state level, when we develop technical assistance and share those best practices and other criterion for consideration or bases for consideration, we can share those with the rest of the state. If you'll go to the next slide there, Scott. So as I mentioned, we want to share best practices. We want to find areas of concern that are consistent among the states so that we can develop technical assistance that addresses those areas. We want to hear from you as we start developing our technical assistance and revise any other procedures related to certification. We want to lean on those areas that feel like they're doing a great job in some areas of the certification as identified, lean on them to provide us the information, share that with those that feel like they've got some deficiencies in some of those same areas. Once we're done, we want, as I mentioned, we want to get a summary of all the criterion bases, including attained and unattained. I think the first time around, while we got a nice list of some of the best practices and notable practices, we didn't get very many when the particular criterion was indicated as attained. Certainly, we received a lot of input when we saw unattained because we expected that a plan for correction would be outlined within the application. This time around, we really want to hear from you again on the methods you considered as meeting and attaining a particular criterion. With that, that concludes the actual presentation part. If anyone has any other questions, if you want to open up the telephone line, Scott, anyone can ask via telephone, or again, if you've got some that have come in through the chat pod. I think what I want to emphasize is that while we didn't go over the new application, that is being finalized. We hope to have that finalized within the next few weeks. Issue that, and then start providing some technical assistance based on the new application, not necessarily the old application. And the new process, there's a little bit more clarity in how the process could occur through each of the local boards and in each of the local areas. So we didn't want to utilize this time to do that until we finalize that, and we plan accordingly to provide you that technical assistance. So any additional questions at this time?
So a couple of questions that do revolve around the application process. There were a couple of questions about the new form, and you've addressed that. Where's the current application housed, and is it available?
Yeah, the application is attached to the policy, and I'm going to forget the number. I want to say it's in the Chapter 1 of the e-policy on Illinois WorkNet, and I think it's .12, but I'm going to give me 2 seconds, and I'll tell you which one it is. Apologize, I didn't have that in front of me. Okay, so the policy is title is certification of one-stop centers. I'm sorry, it's 1.8. The 1.12 is the other policy we've mentioned today, one-stop delivery system under WIOA. So if you go to the e-policy portal and go to Chapter 1 governance, the policy 1.8 on certification is where you'll find all the requirements of this policy, and across the right-hand side or down the right-hand side of each policy page, there are attachments, appendices, technical assistance guides, and it can be found in those. If anyone's having difficulty, feel free to email me, and I'll direct you or provide you a direct link to those documents.
Another one, how often are the summits that you referred to, are they held?
The actual WIOA summits, we do have multiple types of technical assistance. The summit is the largest that we present. We just held the last one in April this year up in Northern Illinois. The planning team has identified a late April 2020 date for the next WIOA summit. I believe those dates are April 28th and 29th. Once we get confirmation of the actual location and dates, although I think we are pretty confirmed there, we're going to be in East Peoria this year, or I'm sorry, next year. We'll get save the date out to everybody. Then we'll be working on content for the summit. Those that you were able to attend in April, all of the sessions related to service integration, you know, that policy, that the concept of service integration is so overarching of everything we do as a system that we were able to attach all of the sessions, workshops, and plenaries to service integration. The 2020 summit, we are still having discussions on what the topics will be, if there'll be what the major theme will be, but certainly I believe service integration will play a key part to that, or elements of service integration, maybe some of those or all of the 7 goals that were outlined. But really, if you've got some ideas that you think should be held in a summit, which is a large scale, one location event, one time a year, you can reach out to me with that information, and we'll take that into consideration in the planning. Workshops and roundtables are more regionally focused, where either 3 or 4 different locations are chosen, north, central, south. Sometimes we break off the north into north and also the Cook County, kind of Collar County areas, because of just the magnitude and size of all of the partners, all of the providers, and staff from those areas. Those are, while they're consistent in the message to attendees, it's really an opportunity for people to look at what's going on in their region of the state, and how we can learn from each other and share best practices, and just better understand particular policies, particular procedures, or requirements of the system. And then we do these webinars. We've asked in the past, and I know we got to wait for them for quite a while as we continue the implementation of WIOA, but we want to ramp these up and utilizing this series of 4 or 5 for service integration to start these up again. We've asked that everyone just go ahead and put these on their calendar every Wednesday from 10 to 11:30. We'll get information out as soon as it becomes available on new sessions. And if you just don't hear from us on a particular date, you can mark that off as you're available for another hour and a half on each Wednesday. But we hope to be able to get some subject matters and topics for future webinars, and we'll start getting those out to everybody in the next several weeks.
An additional question: does a specialized center need to be certified as well?
Specialized centers, as mentioned earlier, are a type of affiliate center. They're specialized in that they don't provide all of the services of all of the partners, but they have a particular focus, whether that be on a population, on a particular key sector, or just specific smaller groups of individuals, maybe because of a layoff. It's all up to the local board whether they want to designate those sites or not, similar to the affiliate sites. And we talked about, and Dave mentioned some of the good reasoning why a local board should consider designating a center as opposed to just having an available site for services to customers. But it is, again, up to the local boards to determine if they are going to be designated or not.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have.
Okay, anyone on the phone line, if the phone lines are open, anyone have any questions that they would rather ask verbally as opposed to typing? Okay, not hearing any of those. I want to thank Dave and Jamie for joining us today, provide us some great information from one of the local areas in Illinois. I want to thank Scott for assisting us facilitating the webinar platform. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you've all been able to attend many or all of these series of webinars related to service integration. As Scott mentioned, starting out the session today, this will be recorded and put on the Illinois WorkNet website. That information can be shared along with the survey. We ask that you complete that survey so that we can learn from you. Was this webinar effective? Did it address your needs? And provide any input for improvement for future webinars. So it's important that we get that feedback. So again, complete the surveys and let us know if you have any concerns with the format, the information, or any recommendations for future sessions or webinars. So again, thank you, everyone, and we'll talk soon on a new webinar. Goodbye.